There is a particular kind of silence that exists only between 2 and 4 in the morning. Not the silence of an empty house, not the silence of a library or a church. Those silences have texture to them, a sense of held breath, of something paused. The silence I'm talking about is different. It's the silence of a world that has genuinely, temporarily, stopped caring whether you exist. The traffic has thinned to almost nothing. The birds haven't started yet. The people you love are in the deepest part of their sleep, past dreaming. Unreachable in the way that only sleeping people can be unreachable. And you are awake in it, moving through a building full of people who are also awake, but awake in ways that have very little to do with ordinary consciousness. I've worked the night shift at Hargrove Psychiatric Institute for 11 years. That's approximately 4,000 nights. 4,000 to 4 in the mornings. 4,000 walks down corridors lit by the kind of institutional fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. 4,000 cups of coffee made in the small break room on the 2nd floor, where the microwave has had a crack in the door handle since my 3rd week and nobody has fixed it. And probably nobody ever will. I want to tell you about what I saw during those 11 years. Not all of it. Some of it is not mine to tell. And some of it I have made peace with in the way you make peace with things you cannot explain. Which is to say, you put them in a particular room in your mind, you close the door, and you choose not to open it unless you have to. But some of what I saw, the thing I am going to tell you about tonight, I think needs to be said out loud. I think it needs to be given words and sent out into the world, because carrying it alone, which is what I have been doing for the past 3 years, is no longer something I am willing to do. His name was Thomas Varin. He was admitted to Hargrove in the spring of 11 years ago, 2 weeks before I started working there. And by the time I began my first shift, he was already what the staff called a fixture. That word tells you something about how long he'd been there, and how little anyone expected that to change. I should tell you what Hargrove is like before I tell you about Thomas, because the place matters. It always matters. You cannot understand what happened without understanding where it happened. And Hargrove is not the kind of place you can describe quickly. The building is old. Not old in the way that gives a building character. Not the warm old of exposed brick and original hardwood floors that people pay extra for in apartments. Old in the institutional sense, which means old in the way that accumulates rather than simply passes. The original structure dates from the 1920s, and it was added to in the 1950s and again in the 1970s. And the additions don't quite match each other or the original. So moving through the building means moving through 3 distinct architectural moods, without transition. The original section has high ceilings and long windows and a kind of faded grandeur that might have been impressive once. The 1950s edition is relentlessly functional, low ceilings, narrow corridors, rooms designed for efficiency rather than anything resembling comfort. The 1970s wing, which is where the long-term patients are housed and where I spent most of my shifts, is something else entirely. The ceilings are a dropped acoustic tile that has yellowed over the decades. The corridor is wide enough for 2 staff members to walk side by side, which was apparently important to whoever designed it. And the rooms open off either side every 20 feet or so. Identical doors with small reinforced windows set into them at eye level. It is the kind of corridor that looks the same from either end. More than once in my first weeks I turned around at one end, and for a disorienting moment was not certain which direction I was facing. Whether I had come from the east side or the west. Whether I was walking toward the nurse's station or away from it. The building had a way of doing that, resetting your sense of direction, making you feel like you had not moved when you had, or like you had moved more than you realized. The long-term ward housed 32 patients during most of my time there. The number varied slightly over the years, people transferred, people discharged on better days. New admissions coming in from the short-term unit or directly from families who had reached the end of what they could manage at home. But 32 was the rough steady state, and of those 32, there were perhaps 6 or 7 who had been there long enough that they were genuinely known to the staff in the way you know a neighbor, which is to say superficially, but with a particular familiarity that comes from proximity over time. Thomas Varon was not one of the 6 or 7. He had been at Hargrove for what I was told was somewhere between 4 and 6 years before I arrived. And I say somewhere between because his records were incomplete in the particular way that records from the early years of long-term cases sometimes are. Transfers, system changes, a staff rotation that had apparently resulted in some documentation being misfiled and never recovered. The facts that were certain were these. Thomas was 43 years old when I met him. He had been admitted following what his intake paperwork described as a prolonged dissociative episode with accompanying behavioral disturbance. He was not violent. He had no family listed as emergency contact. He did not speak. That last part I want to sit with for a moment because it's important, and I don't want to pass over it too quickly. Thomas did not speak. Not in the way some patients don't speak because they're medicated to a level that makes speech difficult. Not in the way some patients don't speak because they are choosing not to, as a form of resistance or self-protection. He was not mute in any physiological sense. The records noted that early in his admission, he had spoken, though the content of what he said was described only as non-responsive to questioning, which could mean many things and probably meant something specific that whoever wrote that note understood, and I never did. But by the time I arrived, Thomas had not said a word to anyone in what the charge nurse estimated was at least 2 years. He communicated in other ways. He ate when food was brought, which showed engagement with the environment. He dressed when prompted with the daily clothes left on the chair in his room, moving through the sequence of buttons and laces with an unhurried competence that suggested these were tasks he was entirely capable of. Just tasks he performed on his own schedule. He walked the corridor during the permitted hours, a slow circuit that he would repeat 3 or 4 times before returning to his room, without being asked to, as if he had an internal timer that ran differently from everyone else's, but ran reliably. When staff spoke to him, explaining what was about to happen, medication time, the change from one activity to the next, his eyes would move to their face and stay there for a moment, long enough that you had the clear impression that information was being received, assessed, filed somewhere, and then his gaze would return to wherever it had been before. His gaze, when it returned to wherever it had been before, was almost always toward the window. His room had one window. It faced the east side of the building, and in the morning it got the early light, and Thomas would stand at it and watch the light arrive in the way that I have only seen into other contexts. In people who have been in enclosed spaces for long enough, that light becomes remarkable again, and in people who are waiting for something specific. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the first time I noticed the thing that I am building toward. It was during my 3rd month at Hargrove, which put it in the early autumn of my first year there. I was working the full overnight, which at Hargrove ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I was doing rounds on the long-term ward at what I estimated was around 3 in the morning. The rounds were not what you might imagine from medical dramas. They were not brisk, efficient walks with clipboards and purposeful footsteps. Night rounds on a stable ward were slow, quiet, a practice of presence more than procedure. You walked, you listened at doors, you paused when something felt not quite right and moved on when it didn't. You developed, over time, a sense of the ward's baseline, its normal texture of sound and air, and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to sleeping people, and you learned to notice when that texture was different. On the night in question, As I came to the eastern end of the corridor and turned to walk back toward the nurse's station, I noticed that the corridor was not quite as it should be. It took me several steps to understand why. The ward was dim at night. The overhead lights turned to their lowest setting, a kind of permanent amber dusk that was gentler than the full fluorescence and disturbed sleep less. In that dimness, the corridor appeared the same from one end as the other, and it was only the small markers you learned over time. The scuff on the baseboard near room 14, the slightly darker paint where a door frame had been repaired years ago near room 22. That told you precisely where you were. I knew this corridor the way you know a path you have walked hundreds of times in the dark, by feel and proximity rather than by sight. But at the far end of the corridor, near the door to the stairwell that staff used and patients did not, there was something I could not immediately account for. A stillness. A specific stillness that was different from the general stillness of the sleeping ward. As if something at the end of the corridor was not moving in a way that was more deliberate than the not moving of furniture or walls. I stopped. I stood in the corridor at roughly its midpoint and I looked at the far end. And I tried to understand what I was seeing. The stairwell door was a fire door, heavier than the room doors, with a small reinforced window in its upper half through which the stairwell light, which ran all night, threw a narrow rectangle of brighter light into the corridor. In that rectangle, or rather in the darkness just outside it, just this side of the threshold between the lit area and the amber dimness of the ward, there was a shape. I want to be precise about what I mean by shape because I have gone over this moment many times in the years since and I want to describe it accurately. It was not a figure in the sense of something clearly human standing at attention. It was more like the suggestion of arrangement, like the darkness at that end of the corridor had organized itself slightly differently than the darkness elsewhere in the corridor, with a vertical emphasis and a density that the surrounding air did not have. I stood there for what was probably 10 seconds, but felt considerably longer, and then the shape moved. It moved the way someone moves when they have been standing still for a long time, and shift their weight from one foot to the other, a barely perceptible realignment, the kind of movement that is registered peripherally before it registers consciously. But the realignment meant that whatever I was looking at was not a trick of the light, not an artifact of dim corridors and tired eyes. It had weight. It occupied space. It had moved. I turned on my flashlight and walked toward the end of the corridor. There was nothing there. The stairwell door was locked, as it always was from the ward side. The corridor was empty in both directions. I checked the nearest rooms, room 28, room 29, room 30, and all 3 patients were in their beds asleep, exactly where they should have been. I walked the full length of the corridor twice and found nothing that explained what I had seen. I wrote it up in my notes that night as a perceptual anomaly, which is the kind of language that sounds technical, but means almost nothing. I had seen something. I could not account for what I had seen. I noted it and moved on because noting and moving on is what you do when you work nights, and you have 11 more hours before your shift ends. I would have forgotten it entirely, except that exactly 1 week later, at almost exactly the same time of night, I saw it again. Same location, same quality of arranged darkness at the end of the corridor. Same impression of something vertical and heavy occupying the space just outside the light from the stairwell door. This time I turned my flashlight on immediately before I began walking toward it. And in the flashlight beam there was nothing. Just the corridor and the door and the scuffed linoleum. But as I turned the flashlight off, in the half-second before my eyes readjusted to the amber dimness, I thought I saw it again. Further away now. Further than the end of the corridor should have allowed for. I told Renata about it. Renata was the charge nurse on nights, a woman who had been at Hargrove for 22 years, and who had the particular quality of steadiness that comes from having seen a great deal, and decided, which parts of it were worth being shaken by. She listened to me describe what I had seen in the corridor, both times. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was actually considering something rather than just waiting for you to stop talking. "End of the East Corridor," she said. I said yes. She nodded, not the nod of someone hearing new information, but the nod of someone hearing something confirm something they already knew. I asked her what that meant. She said that the East Corridor end was Thomas Varen's end of the ward. His room was the last one before the stairwell door. Room 32. I had known this, technically. I had it in my understanding of the ward's geography, but I had not connected it to what I was seeing in the corridor at 3 in the morning, because I had been thinking of what I was seeing as something environmental, something architectural, a trick of the building's particular dimness and age. I had not been thinking of it as a person. "Does he walk at night?" I asked. Renata said that Thomas had not been documented as leaving his room after lights out in all the years she had known him. His nighttime monitoring showed him consistently in his bed, and the records going back years showed the same pattern without exception. I said that I thought I had seen someone in the East Corridor at 3 in the morning, twice. Renata looked at me for a long moment. "What did they look like?" she asked. And that was where it became difficult to answer, because the honest answer was that I was not certain the shape I had seen in the corridor was a person at all, in the conventional sense of that word. It had the feeling of a person. It had the weight and vertical emphasis of a person. But when I tried to describe it in terms of specific features, clothing, height, posture, I found I had nothing solid. I had impression without detail. I had the sense of a presence without the confirming data that usually comes with presence. I told Renata this. She said she thought I should keep watching. That was all she said. Keep watching. As if she already knew what was there and was waiting for me to see it for myself, which I have thought about many times since and still cannot entirely account for. The thing about working nights in a psychiatric ward is that you develop a very particular relationship with observation. You become, over time, extraordinarily good at noticing. You notice which patients are sleeping normally and which are simply lying still. You notice the difference between a calm silence and a watchful one. You notice, in the way that animals notice things, through a combination of peripheral vision and a kind of physical intuition. That is difficult to explain, but very real, when something in your environment has changed. I started paying more attention to Thomas Varen, not in a surveillance sense, not in the way of documenting him more carefully or spending additional formal time on his care. I simply started noticing him more, watching when I walked past his room, observing during the periods when he walked the corridor's permitted circuit, paying attention, in the way that Renata had suggested, to what was actually there. What I noticed, over the weeks that followed, was this. Thomas Varen did something that I had not seen documented in his file and that none of the staff, when I eventually asked carefully about it, seemed to have specifically noticed, though several of them said something like yes, now that you mention it, when I described it. Every night, at some point between lights out and the early shift's arrival, Thomas Varen stood at his window and he watched. He watched the east side of the building, which meant he was watching a stretch of institutional grounds, a parking lot, mostly empty at night, a chain-link fence beyond it, a stand of trees beyond the fence that were black and indistinguishable from each other in the dark. There was nothing out there to watch, in the sense of nothing that would hold a person's attention for the duration. I was beginning to understand Thomas spent at that window. The parking lot had security lighting that cast a flat orange glow over the asphalt, and caught the chain link in a way that made it look like something from a much older time. The trees beyond were simply trees. There was no movement out there that I could see, no pattern that would explain sustained attention. But Thomas's attention was sustained. When I checked on him during rounds, Some nights I would find him in bed, asleep, as the records showed. And some nights I would find him standing at the window, motionless, watching. And on those nights, the quality of his watching was not the casual watching of someone who can't sleep and is passing time with whatever is available to look at. It was focused, directed. It was the watching of someone who had found something specific to watch and was watching it carefully. I started staying a few seconds longer at his window on those nights, just standing in the doorway, looking in, following his line of sight out to the parking lot and the fence and the trees beyond. I never saw anything. The parking lot was always empty. The security lights were steady. The trees were always just trees. But I began to notice something in my peripheral vision that I cannot fully account for. On the nights when Thomas was at the window, when I stood in his doorway and looked out over his shoulder at the east side of the grounds, I began to have the persistent sense that there was something at the edge of my visual field, just outside the reach of direct vision, in that zone where the eye catches movement and shape, but not detail. Something at the tree line, or sometimes at the fence line, or sometimes, and this is the one that stayed with me longest, at the near edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the security lights, in the band of shadow where the orange glow gave out. I turned to look directly at it, every time. And every time there was nothing there. This is the thing about peripheral vision that I have spent a considerable amount of time thinking about since. We tend to trust what we see directly and distrust what we see at the edges. We treat the center of our visual field as the reliable part and the periphery as the noisy part, the part that generates false positives, the part that mistakes shadows for movement and emptiness for presence. There are very good reasons for this. The peripheral visual field has lower acuity and higher sensitivity to motion, which means it detects things before we can identify them, which means it generates alerts that are sometimes false. This is known. This is not in dispute. But the peripheral visual field is not wrong most of the time. It is detecting something real, something in the environment that has either moved or is different in some way from the surrounding field. The question is not whether what you see in the periphery is there. Something is always there. The question is what it is, and whether it is the thing your nervous system has helpfully decided it must be, before you've had a chance to look directly. I am telling you this because I want to be clear that I did not decide what I was seeing in the periphery. I did not arrive at a conclusion and fit my observations around it. I tried very hard to do the opposite. I tried to look without assumptions, and what I kept seeing, without assumptions, was something at the edge of my vision on the nights when Thomas Varon stood at his window and watched. Twice in those early weeks I went outside. During a break, bundled into my jacket against the October chill, I walked out to the parking lot and stood there and looked around. The grounds were entirely quiet. The security light cast its orange glow in a perfect circle around me. I walked to the fence line and looked at the trees. They were just trees, close together. The kind of stand of second-growth forest that springs up on the edges of institutional grounds, where nobody has bothered to keep the grass mowed. And in the dark, they were a single mass without individual form or feature. I stood at the fence for a long time on the second of those nights, in the cold, listening. I cannot tell you that I heard anything. I cannot tell you that I saw anything. What I can tell you is that I had, standing at that fence in the dark, the absolute physical certainty of being observed, not the vague social anxiety of feeling watched in a crowd, not the imaginative jitter of being alone in an unfamiliar place at night. This was something more precise and more bodily, the specific feeling of eyes on your back that every human nervous system knows how to recognize, because it is very old information, older than language. The information that told your ancestors when something in the forest was tracking them, and they needed to make a decision about it immediately. I turned around. The building was behind me, its windows lit amber from within, and in one of those windows, at the east end of the building, on the second floor, I could see Thomas Varon. He was watching me. Not the parking lot. Not the fence. Not the trees, me. Standing at his window with the amber light of the ward behind him. A dark shape against the dark building, and he was looking directly at me. Across the empty parking lot. Across the distance between us. And he was watching me in exactly the way that I had been watching the tree line. Which is to say, with complete focused attention. With a quality of direction that made it unmistakably clear that I was the specific thing his gaze had found. I raised my hand. I don't know why I did that. It was an instinctive gesture. The kind of thing you do across a distance when someone is looking at you. And you want to acknowledge the looking, to say, I see that you see me. To close the gap of observation with something reciprocal. It is what you do when someone waves from across a room. It is what you do when you catch a stranger's eye from one car to another at a red light. It is a deeply human reflex, and I made it without thinking. Thomas Varon did not raise his hand back. He stood at his window and watched me for a moment longer. And then, in the unhurried way that everything about Thomas Varon was unhurried, he turned away from the window and was gone. I stood in the parking lot in the cold for another minute, looking at his window, which was now empty and lit amber and entirely unremarkable. Then I went back inside. I want to tell you about what I eventually learned, slowly, over the following months, about Thomas Varon's history. I want to tell you about it carefully because some of what I learned came from records, and some from Renata, and some from a conversation with the attending psychiatrist, who had been managing Thomas's care for most of his time at Hargrove, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, who chose her words with an exactness that I came to understand was not caution exactly, but something more like respect for the difficulty of the subject. Thomas Varon had grown up in a small town in eastern Tennessee. He had been, by all available accounts from his pre-admission life, an unremarkable person in the best sense of that word. Steady, reliable, the kind of person who showed up when he said he would, who did his work without drama, who was liked without being particularly noticeable. He had worked as a land surveyor for most of his adult life, which is a profession that requires a particular combination of precision and patience, a tolerance for long hours in empty spaces, a comfort with silence and slow, careful measurement. He had a wife. Her name was Carol. They had been married for 11 years when Thomas was admitted to Hargrove, and Carol had been, according to the intake records and the early case notes, actively involved in his care for the first 2 years of his admission. She had come for weekly visits. She had participated in the family meetings with Dr. Marsh. She had written letters and brought things from home. Objects the records described as personal items selected for familiarity and comfort. And then, somewhere in year 3 of Thomas's admission, the visits had stopped. The letters had stopped. Dr. Marsh, when I asked about this, was quiet for a moment in her precise way. And then she said that Carol Varon had reached the limit of what she could sustain without change, and that reaching that limit was entirely understandable, and she held no judgment about it. And that was the extent of what Dr. Marsh was willing to say on the subject, and I respected that. But here is what Thomas's records contained about the period before his admission, the period of the event, as Dr. Marsh always referred to it, with a weight given to the phrase that suggested it was more than a clinical formality, that the word event was doing significant work. Thomas had been surveying a parcel of land in a remote part of the county where he worked. Standard contract work, land boundary verification for a property sale. He had gone out on a Thursday morning and he had not come back. His truck had been found the following day, parked at the edge of a logging road that accessed the property. His equipment was in the truck. His lunch, still packed in its cooler and touched. Everything suggested that he had parked, gotten out, and simply not come back to the truck. He was found 5 days later. I want to be very careful in how I describe this part, because the records are incomplete and the accounts that exist are filtered through several layers of interpretation, and I have tried, as I have with everything I am telling you, to separate what is documented from what is speculated. What is documented is this. Thomas was found 5 days after his disappearance, approximately 2 miles from where his truck had been parked, in a part of the property that was heavily wooded and had not been part of his survey assignment. He was found by a search party that had been looking for him since his first night missing. He was found standing upright in the woods in the middle of the day. He was not injured. He was not hypothermic despite 5 nights in the Tennessee woods in March, which the records noted was medically significant and not fully explained. He was not disoriented in the way a person lost in the woods for 5 days would typically be disoriented. He was not calling for help or moving toward the searchers when they found him. He was standing in a small clearing, facing east, and he was watching. When the searchers reached him and spoke to him, he turned and looked at them with a quality of attention that several of them later described in the statements taken for the missing persons report as strange. One of the searchers, a volunteer who had done this work for many years, said in his statement that Thomas had looked at them the way you might look at something that was interrupting you, not afraid of them, not relieved to see them, not registering much of anything, just registering that they were there and that their being there was relevant information, and continuing to process whatever he had been processing before they arrived. He walked out of the woods with them without difficulty. He got into the vehicle they had brought. He did not speak on the drive back, and he did not speak that night, and he did not speak in the days that followed. And as far as the records I had access to could tell, he had spoken only those few undocumented words in the early weeks of his admission, and then not at all for the remaining years. Dr. Marsh, when I asked her what she believed had happened in those 5 days, said she thought the honest answer was that she did not know. She had theories, she said. They were not, she added, theories she was entirely comfortable with. She said this with the manner of someone who has made peace with uncertainty by holding it very carefully, at a distance, where it could not do too much damage. I asked her what the theories were. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, Thomas experienced something in those 5 days that changed his relationship to the world around him, not his capacity to be in the world, not his ability to function, but the thing he understood himself to be doing here, in it, the purpose of it. I think he found something out there, or something found him, and whatever it was, his attention has been on it ever since. I asked her what he was watching for when he stood at his window at night. She said she had asked him that question many times over many years, and he had never answered it. But she said that early in his admission, in those few early weeks when he had still sometimes spoken, a staff member had been sitting with him at the window during the day, and Thomas had turned to her and said something. The staff member, a young man who had not stayed at Hargrove very long, had written it in the notes, slightly uncomfortable with how to categorize it, and filed it in the record under patient statements, which is where Dr. Marsh had found it years later. What Thomas had said was this: it comes back. Every night it comes back, but I don't think it knows that I can see it. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you what I think you might be doing with this information, because I've watched myself do it over the years and I recognize the shape of it. You are probably organizing what I've told you into a framework you already have. The framework might be psychiatric. Thomas experienced a trauma or a break, and his behavior since is an expression of that experience, refracted through whatever it has become in the years of his illness. The framework might be more generous than that, open to the possibility that he found or experienced something real, something in those 5 days in the Tennessee woods that had an objective existence outside his mind. and that his subsequent watchfulness was not illness but attention, a particular focused long-term attention to something that warranted it. I don't think I can tell you which framework is correct. I have spent 3 years turning it over and I don't know. What I can tell you is that over the following months, as I kept watching, as I kept paying attention the way Renata had told me to, I accumulated a series of experiences that did not fit comfortably into either framework, and that I have not been able to dismiss. The shape in the corridor continued appearing. Not every night, perhaps once every week or 10 days, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always at the east end of the corridor near Thomas's room. I became better at seeing it, which I think is the right way to describe it. It did not become more visible. I became more able to look at it. The way you become able, through practice, to hold a difficult image in focus rather than sliding off it into something easier. It was always at the edge of the light from the stairwell door, never fully in the light, never fully in the amber dimness of the corridor, in the threshold, in the thin uncertain zone between one kind of seeing and another. And it was always facing toward Thomas's room. I began checking on Thomas immediately after seeing it in the corridor. Not the next morning, not later in my round. Immediately, before I turned my flashlight on and walked toward the stairwell, I would go directly to room 32 and look through the small reinforced window. On every single occasion when I saw the shape in the corridor, Thomas was at his window. I documented this. I wrote it in my personal notes, which were not part of the official record, because I had no clinical language for what I was documenting and no procedure that applied to it. What I was recording was a correlation. Shape in corridor, Thomas at window. Every time, without exception. And then, on a Tuesday night in February, approximately 8 months after I had first noticed the shape in the corridor, I saw something that changed what I understood to be happening. I was at the east end of the corridor, standing near Thomas's room, having just confirmed through the window that he was at his post at the window watching. I was about to turn and walk back toward the nurse's station, and I glanced at the stairwell end of the corridor, the usual direction, the place where the shape appeared. The corridor was empty. I looked for a moment, confirming the absence, and then I turned to leave. And as I turned, my flashlight's beam swept briefly across the wall to my left. The wall of the corridor between Thomas's room and the room before it, room 31. And in the fraction of a second before I corrected the angle of the beam, I saw something on that wall. I stopped. I brought the beam back. The wall was plain. Institutional paint. The slightly off-white that ages into a kind of grey. Unmarked, as it had always been. As all the corridor walls were except for the occasional scuff and the numbers on the room doors. But for that fraction of a second, in the sweep of the flashlight beam, I had seen a shadow on the wall that did not correspond to anything in the corridor. Not my shadow. I was standing at the wrong angle for it to be my shadow. Not a shadow cast by any of the room doors or the corridor lighting. A shadow of something vertical. Something with a height that was approximately the height of a person, falling on the wall between rooms 31 and 32 at an angle that suggested its source was standing approximately where I was standing, except I was the only thing standing where I was standing. I moved the flashlight slowly. I moved it in an arc, watching the wall, and the shadow moved with the light in the way shadows move when the light source changes angle, which meant the shadow was real, which meant it was being cast by something that was blocking the flashlight beam, something between my flashlight and the wall, something at approximately arm's reach from where I was standing. I turned the flashlight off, in the amber dimness of the corridor, with my eyes readjusting. I could not see anything in front of me. The corridor appeared empty in both directions. The air was still. The ward was quiet with the particular 3 in the morning quiet that I had known for months. The reliable, unchanging texture of a building full of sleeping people. But I had the feeling, the old bodily feeling, the one I had stood at the fence line with in October, The one that is older than language. Something was standing next to me in the corridor. I stood very still. I do not know for how long, probably less than a minute, possibly considerably less. I breathed as evenly as I could. I kept my eyes on the middle distance of the corridor, rather than trying to look directly at anything close to me, because by this point I had developed some understanding of how this worked, which is to say that direct looking was not where this particular perception was available, and in the periphery of my vision, to my left, at roughly arm's length, I saw it. Not a shape, not the arranged darkness from the end of the corridor. Something more specific. Something that had edges and a vertical emphasis, and that was standing next to me. In the amber corridor, as still as the walls on either side of it. As still as Thomas in his room behind me. Watching the same thing, he was watching from a different angle. I turned on the flashlight. The corridor was empty. I walked to the nurse's station, and I sat down and I did not write anything in my notes for a while. I sat with the particular sensation of someone who has just been given a piece of information they did not ask for and are not certain they wanted and cannot now unhave. I told Renata the next morning. I told her everything. The corridor shape, the correlation with Thomas, the shadow, the moment of standing next to something in the corridor with my flashlight off. I told it all to her in the break room over coffee that neither of us was really drinking. And she listened the way she always listened, with complete attention and no visible alarm. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you worked here now?" I said 9 months. She nodded. "In the years I've been here," she said, "they have been for people who work the long-term ward overnight long enough to start noticing. 4 in 22 years. You're the 5th. I asked her what the others had done. 2 of them decided they'd been working too many nights and took transfers. 1 asked for days and got them, and I don't think he ever mentioned it again. 1 stayed. I asked about the one who stayed. Renata said his name was Paulo and he had worked nights at Hargrove for 7 years, overlapping with Thomas's admission, and he had done what I was doing, watching, paying attention, trying to understand what was there. She said he had told her, near the end of his time at Hargrove, that he thought Thomas was not crazy. She said Paulo had been very precise about this, that he was not saying Thomas was well, not dismissing the genuine difficulty of his condition or the real limitations of his daily life, but that the specific thing Thomas was doing, the watching, the long patient nightly attention to the east side of the grounds, was not a symptom, was not an expression of illness, was the right response to what was actually there. I asked her what Paulo thought was actually there. Renata was quiet for a moment, in a way that was different from her usual considering something silence. This was the silence of someone choosing how to give you something that they themselves have not entirely made peace with. He said he thought it came from the woods, she said. Whatever it is. He said Thomas had found it, or it had found Thomas, out there in Tennessee. And when Thomas came back, when they brought Thomas back, it came back too. He said it had been here ever since, coming every night to find him. I sat with that for a while. And Thomas, I said, he knows that? Yes, Renata said. I think Thomas has known that since before he got here. I think that's what he's doing every night, making sure it knows where he is, making sure it can find him, so it doesn't have to look. I want to tell you what I think about that, what I have thought about it for 3 years, turning it over in the quiet of the nights that followed, and the nights after those, and all the nights between then and this one. Thomas Varon stood at his window every night and watched the eastern grounds, and what he was watching for came back, reliably, every night, and stood in the darkness at the edge of the parking lot and looked back at him. And what it was, whether it was something external to Thomas or something that had grown from whatever happened in those 5 days in the Tennessee woods, whether it was dangerous or simply present, whether it meant him harm or was doing exactly what Renata suggested, finding him, returning to the place where he was, making the nightly circuit the way a person makes a nightly circuit of the things that matter to them. I do not know. What I know is that Thomas Varon watched for it every night, and every night it came. And I know that whatever I had been standing next to in the corridor that February night, in the amber dimness of a sleeping ward, was not afraid of me. It had no reaction to my flashlight. It had no reaction to my presence. It was simply there, standing next to me in the corridor, and looking in the same direction Thomas was looking, and then not there when I turned the light on, and then presumably still there in the way it had always been there, in the peripheral registers of perception, in the place just outside direct observation that we have trained ourselves, over many reasonable and sane years of modern life, to dismiss. I left Hargrove after 11 years because a position opened at a facility closer to my family, and the commute to Hargrove had been significant, and the timing was right in the practical ways that timing sometimes is. I gave appropriate notice. I did my handovers carefully. I said goodbye to the staff I had worked alongside for a decade. On my last night, I did rounds on the long-term ward one final time. I walked the corridor in the amber dimness, past the scuff on the baseboard near room 14, past the slightly darker paint near room 22. I walked to the east end of the corridor and I stood there for a while, looking toward the stairwell door, looking at the narrow rectangle of brighter light its window threw into the corridor. The corridor was empty, as it almost always was, quiet with the 3 in the morning quiet that I had grown to know as well as any quiet I have known. I went to room 32 and looked through the small reinforced window. Thomas was at the window, as he was on many nights, standing in the posture I had watched for years, upright, still, unhurried, watching the eastern grounds. I stood in his doorway for a moment. I do not know if he knew I was there. I don't know if it matters. I did what I had seen other people do in other stories, in other versions of this same essential situation. I stayed, just for a minute. I stood there and I was present and I watched with him, out over the empty parking lot, out toward the fence and the tree line beyond it. I did not see anything in the trees, but at the edge of the parking lot, at the far boundary of the security light's orange reach, in the band of shadow between the lit and unlit, something was there, not visible in any direct sense, not available to looking, just present, in the peripheral registers where I had learned to look, in the place that peripheral vision maintains at the edge of direct sight, reliable and attentive and watching back. Thomas stood at his window, and I stood in his doorway, and for the length of a few minutes, the 3 of us were simply there together, in the particular silence that exists between 2 and 4 in the morning, in a building full of sleeping people, in the amber light of an old ward, with the parking lot empty and the trees black and the thing at the edge of the light, doing whatever it had been doing every night for all the years I had been there, and all the years before that, coming back, reliably, to the window where Thomas was. I raised my hand, the same instinctive gesture I had made years before in the parking lot, looking up at his window, the gesture that means I see that you see me. Thomas did not raise his hand, but after a moment, very slowly, he turned from the window and he looked at me. And in 11 years of working nights at Hargrove, in all the observations and rounds and 3 in the morning silences, it was the only time Thomas Varon had ever directly looked at another person's face in a way that I could only describe, if I had to describe it, as recognition, not the registering of information look, not the turning to assess what the interruption is look, a recognition, the look that says, I know you are here, and I am glad of it. And there are things I could tell you if either of us had the words. I said good night to him. I said it quietly, in the doorway, to the room where he was standing in the amber light with the dark window behind him, and the eastern grounds beyond that and the thing at the edge of the parking lot beyond that. He turned back to the window. I walked down the corridor for the last time. Past the darker paint near room 22, past the scuff near room 14. Back to the nurse's station and the coffee that was never quite right. And the microwave with the cracked handle and all the small permanences of a place you have known for a long time and are about to leave. I want to tell you, before I let you go tonight, about the thing that has stayed with me longest from all of this. Not the shape in the corridor, not the shadow on the wall, not the feeling of standing next to something in the amber dark that I could not see directly. It's Thomas at his window. It's the faithfulness of it, the nightly, patient, unhurried faithfulness. Whatever happened to him in those Tennessee woods in March, whatever the 5 days changed in him, and they changed something profound and irrevocable. Whatever understanding he came back with that took him outside the range of ordinary speech and ordinary social presence, he had organized it into this, a practice, a post, a nightly appointment that he kept with a consistency that I have rarely seen in any person. Something came back every night to find him, and he was always there. There is something in that, I think. Something beyond the fear of it, beyond the strangeness of it, the reciprocity of it, the nightly return and the nightly watching, the thing from the trees and the man at the window, the dark outside and the amber within, the parking lot empty under its orange security light like a stage set up for something. You are not quite arriving early enough to see. Renata said Thomas was making sure it could find him, making sure it didn't have to search. I think she was right, but I also think there was something more in it. Something about the nature of Thomas's long silence and his long stillness, and his complete apparent indifference to everything in the human world, except the view from that window. I think Thomas had found, in those 5 days in the woods, something that had then found him. And whatever it was, whatever it meant, he had decided that his job, the thing he was here to do, was to hold still and be findable, to be the landmark, to be the light that didn't move so that the other thing could navigate by it. There are people like that. You have probably met one or two in your life if you have been paying attention. People who seem to have organized their entire existence around being findable, being present, being the one who is there when others are not. It usually looks, from the outside, like stillness or like absence, like someone who has stepped back from the ordinary business of life, and has nothing to show for the stepping back. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. But sometimes the stepping back is in service of something. Sometimes the stillness is functional. Sometimes the person at the window knows exactly what they're doing, and is doing it with a commitment that puts ordinary busyness to shame. I do not know what Thomas Varon found in the Tennessee woods. I do not know what comes back to the parking lot every night. I do not know what was standing next to me in the corridor in February, or what has been standing in that corridor on the nights since I left, because I have not been there to see it and someone else is doing rounds now, and whether they notice or do not notice is not something I can know. What I know is what I saw, what I felt, the shadow on the wall, and the shape at the corridor's end, and the old bodily certainty of being next to something that did not require the confirmation of direct vision. And Thomas at his window, every night, patient as the building itself, watching the east. The night outside your window right now is ordinary. The parking lots of the world are empty or nearly empty. The tree lines are just tree lines. The security lights are steady. Whatever is in the peripheral registers of your own perception tonight, whatever is at the edge of your seeing, whatever you have trained yourself not to look at directly, because direct looking always makes it go away, that is yours. I cannot tell you what it is. I cannot tell you whether looking at it or not looking at it is the right response. I have not figured that out for myself in 3 years of thinking about it. What I can tell you is that Thomas Varon made a choice, or something in those 5 days made the choice for him, and the choice was this: to be present, to be still, to be at the window every night without fail, for all the years since. watching and being watched, and whatever came to the edge of the parking lot every night. In the dark outside the reach of the security lights, it came back. It always came back. It found the window, found the light, found the man standing in the amber glow, who had organized his entire existence around being there when it arrived. I have thought about that, in the quiet hours, more than I have thought about the fear of it, more than I have thought about what it was, or where it came from, or what it wanted. I have thought about the reliability of it, the nightly faithfulness, the way the darkness showed up, and the way the light showed up, and the way they found each other. Across the parking lot, through the reinforced glass, in the amber hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the world has stopped caring whether anyone exists. They knew where each other were. That is not nothing. Whatever else it was, that is not nothing. The night is long. The window is yours. And whatever watches back from the far edge of the light. It has been there every night and it will be there again tomorrow. In the place just outside, what we have agreed to look at directly. Patient and steady and finding its way home to you. Let your eyes be heavy. Let the dark be ordinary. You are known here. You have always been known here. Rest now.